This parsha, this Torah portion by Yishlach, follows the preceding one, as one could expect, which discusses how Yaakov flees the wrath of his brother Esau, and he travels to his uncle Lavan. He marries Lavan's two daughters and their handmaidens, bears at this point 11 children. And now, after 22 years, he's returning to his father. And he knows that he's going to have to confront his brother Esau, who wanted to kill him. So he wanted to gauge the degree to which Esau's anger still persisted, or perhaps it had subsided. So the Torah portion begins with the words, Vayishlach Yaakov malachim lefanav, and Yaakov sent angels ahead of him to his brother Esau, and he tells these angels, this is what you should say to my master, to Esau. This is what your servant Jacob said. I have been living with Lavan, and I have delayed until now. And I acquired oxen, donkeys, flocks, servants, and maids. I have sent to tell this to my master, to find favor in your eyes. And the angels returned, and he said to Jacob, we came to your brother. He is also heading towards you, and 400 men are with him. And Yaakov was very worried and pained, and so on. The Torah is telling us that Yaakov did not know what his brother Esau would do. What was his reaction? So he sends angels. Now the Hebrew word malachim has two translations. One is messengers, and one is angels. And Rashi prefers the translation of malachim as angels. So the commentators disagree about why they feel Rashi says that they were angels. One commentator, known as the Mizrahi, says you just have to look at the end of last week's portion when it talks about Yaakov went on his way and he was met by godly angels. So right before this, we see that Yaakov had an association with angels. They accompanied him. So it makes sense when the Torah uses the word angels here, it's referring to the same angels. That's the Mizrahi. The Lavush, another great commentator, is going back 400 so years, he says that Yaakov wanted to impress Esau. He wanted to make sure that Esau knows that he has power and that Esau should not take Jacob as a weakling and that he could be vulnerable. So what does Yaakov do? He sends angels. If angels could be sent by Yaakov, Yaakov has command over angels, Esau would perhaps realize that it's not a good idea to start up with Yaakov. The Rebbe gives a simpler explanation. The Rebbe says that Yaakov, we can see from the fact that he's sending angels, or sending anyone, that he was concerned about Esau's reaction, because Esau wanted to kill him. And he had no way of knowing if Esau was threatening to kill him still at this point or not. If he sends messengers, he's putting their lives in danger. We know that Yaakov felt terribly guilty with the disappearance of Joseph, because Jacob sent Joseph to see how his brothers were doing, and that's when Joseph was disappeared, and Yaakov thought he was killed. So he knew that this is a story that happens later on, but we know that when Yaakov sends somebody and it ends up in a very negative way, that it's a source of guilt and of pain. So Yaakov would not have wanted to send humans who were vulnerable and could have been attacked by Esau. So he sends angels. Angels have nothing to worry about. And what does he tell the angels? He says, you should tell my master Esau that I lived with Lavan and I delayed until now. So Rashi says, what is he trying to tell him when he says, I delayed with Lavan? Why would Esau care where he had been? Why would Esau care what Yaakov did for the last 22 years? So Rashi says that the word garti, which means I lived, has the implication that I never became a full-fledged, important resident. I was only like the Hebrew word garti. The root is ger. Ger means a foreigner, an outsider. And therefore you shouldn't hate me for having appropriating the blessings of our father, that I will become very wealthy and very prosperous. I never really became that wealthy and prosperous. I was always like a stranger. So don't worry about that. Those blessings that I took from you, they didn't materialize. That's one explanation Rashi gives. Another explanation Rashi gives that the Hebrew word garti, I lived, I sojourned, if you rearrange the letters or if you just add them up, it gives you Taryag 6:13. And Yaakov is saying that even though I lived with the wicked Lavan, I observed the 613 commandments, and I did not learn from his evil actions. I did not become influenced by Lavan. What is Yaakov trying to tell Esau? So commentaries explain that he was trying to tell him, our father's blessing to me was contingent. It was contingent on me, and later on the Jewish people, my descendants, would be faithful to the teachings of the Torah. Therefore, you would think that if I wasn't faithful to these teachings, I would be vulnerable and you could win and prevail over me in a struggle. But I want you to know that I'm not vulnerable because I kept all the 613 commandments. Although, as we discussed in an earlier class, the fact that he married two sisters means that he violated one of the 613 commandments, which clearly in the book of Leviticus clearly outlaws marrying two sisters. So how could Yaakov say he observed all the 613? So one of the answers that the Rabbi gives is that he had a commandment that he had to marry Rachel even after he had married Leah, because he promised Rachel, and he would have caused a tremendous grief and pain, which he was duty-bound to avoid doing, whereas observing the commandment not to marry two sisters was not incumbent upon him. That was a voluntary thing, and when you have an obligation, it trumps your voluntary behavior, even if it's a very good behavior. So he didn't violate the 613. At any rate, whatever the explanation is, I kept all 613, and I didn't learn from his evil actions, and therefore I'm not vulnerable. The question is asked, Rashi seems to add words that are unnecessary. Rashi says, I observed the 613 commandments, as the word garti suggests, alludes to, and I didn't learn from his evil doings. Well, isn't it obvious if he kept the 613 that he didn't do anything evil? Why does Rashi have to add those words? So one explanation is that Nachmanides writes that a person could keep all the commandments and still be a despicable person. That means you could follow all the commandments, because technically you could do everything right, but the way you do it is one in which you are a degraded individual. For example, a person can do all the commandments and be arrogant and be condescending towards others. There may not be a technical violation of one of the 613, although that could be debatable in and of itself, but a person is still not a decent and not a refined person, because you could find ways and find loopholes to get out of observing a commandment, so technically you're not in violation of it, but you could still be a person who is a lowly individual. That's what Rashi says. I kept the 613, but I didn't just keep them in a perfunctory way, a mechanical way. I did it with meaning, with depth, with refinement, and I didn't learn from his evil ways. Nothing rubbed off on me. In addition to the fact that I technically observed everything, I did it with the right approach, with the right attitude. Then I would like to suggest another interpretation. When Rashi says, I didn't learn from his evil doings, there are two ways a person has to deal and can deal and should deal with evil. One way is to shun it. Anytime a person is tempted with doing something that is contrary to God's will, you struggle with it. In most cases, you're not above it, but you struggle with it and you prevail, and you do not succumb to the temptation. You shun the evil behavior. You reject it. You repudiate it. That's one approach, which is, of course, the proper approach, and there's great merit associated with anyone who struggles with evil and prevails. Then there's a second approach. The second approach is that you actually use evil to grow. You learn lessons from evil. Now you would think, how could we talk about learning lessons from evil? King David already says that when he describes how I can learn things from my enemies. The famous story is told of Rabbi, the great Hasidic master, who said, I could learn 7 things from a thief. The thief does things clandestinely. He doesn't show off his actions. If he fails once, he tries again. And 5 other lessons you can learn from a thief. The famous Chassid Reb Mendel Futterfass, who spent years in the Gulag, in prison, under the Soviets, said apparently Reb Zusha was not in prison, because if he had been in prison, there's much more than 7 things that you could learn. Just like to share one of the things that he taught. He was in the cell together with a bunch of brigands, a bunch of criminals, really hardened criminals, and they didn't have respect for prison norms, prison rules. They weren't allowed to play cards. I think the prison guards didn't want them to be playing, because if someone would lose, he would get upset and he would attack, and this would cause fights. At any rate, this was banned, playing cards. But they smuggled in a deck of cards and they were playing. And when the guard would be near them, they would hide the cards. Well, once the prison guard was suspicious that they were playing the cards, so he came to the cell and he demanded to know if there were any cards, and no, there were no cards. They were not. They stopped playing. At one point, he suspected that they were playing, because as soon as he left, they took out the cards and they continued playing. At one point, he said, I am going to check everyone. Everyone had to empty their pockets, and he realized that there were no cards. And he left the cell, and soon after that, the cards appeared again. So Reb Mendel was curious to know, how did they do it? They emptied everything, and he maybe even patted them down to make sure they're not hiding it in their clothing. So how could the cards disappear and then appear again? Where did they hide the cards? So the leading criminal there said, we hid it on the body of the guard. When the guard was in the cell, they put the cards in one of his pockets, and when he left, they took it out. So the lesson you could learn from this is sometimes you're searching for something, searching for it in someone else, and you discover that it's in you. You have that quality or that fault. Shouldn't look at others for it. You can find it in yourself. And many other lessons. So one way of learning how to behave is to look at the way evil is committed. If you see an evil person committing a crime, but he does it with passion, with vigor, you should definitely not learn how to become a criminal, but you should learn how to use that passion for something good. Or as King David says, "Me'ovai tichakmeni," for my enemies, it makes me smart. I see how my enemies operate, and I'll use those same tactics in a positive way. So those are 2 approaches to dealing with evil. One is to break it, to shun it, to destroy it in some cases, as we're commanded to destroy Amalek. Amalek is pure, unmitigated evil. You can't really do very much with Amalek, but then sometimes you could salvage things from evil. You could see the good in the evil itself. And Jacob says, you know what? I didn't have to deal with evil at all. There's a third approach, that you rise above it. it doesn't affect you. You don't recognize it. You shun it completely as if it doesn't exist. You don't have to struggle with it. That's the difference between the weekdays and Shabbos. In the weekdays, no matter what you do, because you're engaged in work and you're engaging the world, you have to confront. It's inevitable. You're going to confront evil and you're going to struggle with it. So you can do it in any of those two ways or both ways. You shun the evil, but you learn lessons from it. But learning lessons from evil means you're still dealing with evil. And sometimes when you're dealing with evil, some of it could rub off on you and some of it could overtake you and overpower you. But when it comes to Shabbos, we don't have to struggle with evil. Shabbos is a day that we're above the fray. We rise into a higher sphere of existence. We're no longer connected to the ground. We're in the heavens. That's the difference, by the way, between Jacob and Israel. We're going to soon talk about how Jacob was renamed Israel, but the name Jacob still remained because there are two different modes that a Jew can be in. One is the Jacob mode, the weekday mode, where you're struggling with evil, and one is the Shabbos mode, where you're above the evil. So Jacob is saying, I kept all the 613 commandments. Yes. And when it comes to evil, I didn't even learn from his evil doings. Not that I didn't emulate him. That's obvious. But I didn't even deal with the evil to learn lessons from his evil, to learn how to become a better person by adopting and adapting evil to the realm of goodness. I was in a Shabbos mode all these years. And there's an interesting midrash that says that Jacob kept Shabbos in the house of Lavan. Why is that significant? It means even though he didn't necessarily keep Shabbos literally, although if he kept the 613 commandments, he did, but the point is that he had a Shabbos attitude, that he was above the fray. There's another thing that the commentaries tell us. When Jacob tells the angels, Ko Tomrun, thus you shall say, Ko means this is the way it should be said. The Talmud says when the Torah uses the word ko, like in the priestly blessing, it says ko tivarochu, so or thus shall you bless the people. It has to be literally in the holy tongue, in the language of the Torah. You can't use translation. There are certain things that you can do in translation. You could pray in any language. God understands every language, although it's preferable to pray in the holy tongue, in Hebrew, because it has certain kedusha, certain holiness, and it has certain power. But if a person can't pray in Hebrew, they're allowed to pray in any language. But there are certain things that you can only do in Hebrew. And how do we know from the Torah's way of phrasing things that you can do it and you have to do it in Hebrew? When I say Hebrew, I'm talking about the holy tongue, the biblical language of Hebrew. It's when the Torah uses the word ko. This is the way it is. Thus, or so shall you say it. And that when Yaakov is charging the angels with going to his brother Esau, he tells them, Ko, this is what you do it. Say it in Hebrew. Say it in the holy tongue. What is the significance of saying it in the holy tongue? Why was it important that he speaks to Esau in the holy tongue? Why was that such an important thing? One could argue that in those days, the patriarchs, that's the language they spoke. So why would the angels want to translate it into another language? For what purpose? So one explanation could be that we find, the Talmud says that Adam obviously spoke the holy tongue. That's the language with which God created the world. But he also spoke Aramaic. Aramaic was the language of translation. When did the Jews start speaking Aramaic? Where do we find Aramaic in the Torah? The biblical book of Ezra and Daniel, these books were written after the destruction of the first temple when the Jews were sent into exile. It became the exile language. Jews went to Babylonia, and that's where they spoke Aramaic. So Aramaic expresses the idea of exile. You're far away from the sources of holiness. Hebrew is the source of holiness. So it could be that the patriarchs also spoke Hebrew and Aramaic, and Esau preferred Aramaic because it didn't have the same holiness as the Hebrew. And Esau, being a very uncouth, a very unrefined, a very materialistic, a very non-spiritual person, that's why he sold the birthright, because he thought the birthright meant that you have to take over the legacy of your father, the spiritual mission of your father, of his father Yitzchak, Isaac, and his grandfather Abraham, and he was not prepared to do that. So maybe the language that he was more proficient in and more likely to be receptive to would be Aramaic. So the Midrash tells us no. He spoke, he told him converse only in Hebrew. Why Hebrew? Why did he want the angels to speak to Esau in Hebrew? So there could be several explanations. One explanation is that language, Hebrew, indicated that he was still inspired with holiness, even though he came from a place where there was unholiness. Lavan was a very unholy person. As we said before, that he kept all the commandments, didn't learn from his evil ways, that he maintained a spirit of holiness throughout the entire time that he was with Lavan. Another explanation could be, the Jerusalem Talmud says that every language is suited for certain things. There's a language that's good for music. There's a language that's good for war. There's a language that's good for dirges, lamenting things. There's a language that's good for prayer. Hebrew is a language that's good for prayer. It's the language that we communicate with God in. That's the language God communicates with us, and we communicate back in Hebrew. Aramaic is good for sorrowful words, word dirges, lamentations. Aramaic has a certain sadness to it. And Yaakov was trying to tell Esau, I never experience sadness. I was always in a state of joy. Why was I in a state of joy? Because I always felt closeness to God, and God is the source of joy. And if you're always in a state of joy, exile does not have the power to change a person. You remain above and beyond the limits of exile. I'm not an exile Jew. I am a holy Jew. I am a Jew who is completely consumed with the holiness of the Holy Tongue, and therefore I'm not vulnerable. So then the question is, why was he so concerned after he saw Esau, he was told, is approaching him with 400 men? If he was so secure with himself that he was righteous, he kept all the 613 commandments, he didn't learn from his evil ways in any way, and he spoke the holy tongue that indicated his spirituality had not waned in any way, why was he so concerned with the coming of Esau with 400 men? He knew he's going to prevail. So one way of explaining it is that, what is the significance of 400? Kabbalists put a lot of emphasis on the number 400. They connect it to the fact that Abraham paid for the cave of Machpelah to Ephron with 400 silver talents. So, but what is the simple understanding, or maybe not the simple one, but the allusion, the remez, the hint in the 400? 400 are the number of years God said to Abraham that his children will be slaves in a foreign land, will be persecuted in a foreign land. So 400 symbolizes exile. Esau was trying to tell Yaakov, you're coming from Lavan with 20 years that you spent with Lavan, and you didn't become affected. It didn't, anything associated with Lavan did not rub off on you. You remained above everything. You were a Shabbos Jew. You were consumed with the holy tongue and all these things. You kept all the commandments. That's wonderful, because you were only there 20 years. Imagine how what's going to happen if you have to be in exile for 400 years. It's certainly going to do a job on you, and you will change. And therefore, you're not so impervious to the threats that come from the outside, and you are vulnerable. That's why Jacob was now concerned, because when he realized that there's going to be a 400-year exile, he was concerned not about himself personally, but he was concerned about the future, how the Jews would fare in the future. But you know what? Even after those 400 years, and we did become affected by the exile. The Jews, when they left Egypt, they were descended into 49 of 50 levels of impurity, but they were still salvageable because they didn't go down to the 50th level. So in spite of everything, we still prevailed after those 400 years. And even after the 2,000 years of exile, the last exile that persists to this day, although we believe we're on the cusp of the final redemption, we suffered greatly, not just physically, but also spiritually. The exile rubbed off on us. We stopped speaking the holy tongue, literally and figuratively. We speak the language of exile, but we still maintained our identities, and we still have the virtue that keeps us protected, and may we be protected from the desires of all of our enemies to try to destroy us, the way Esau wanted to destroy Yaakov, and the way Lavan wanted to destroy Yaakov. Then Yaakov confronts his brother Esau, but on the way he realizes he left things behind, and he crosses over a river, and he confronts this man, which was really an angel, Esau's guardian angel, and they engage in a struggle all night long. And in the morning, the angel cannot win the battle, but he strikes Yaakov in his leg, and Yaakov starts to limp, and Yaakov doesn't let him go. And he says, "You have to let me go now." And Yaakov says, "You have to bless me." And he says, "Your name is no longer Jacob, your name is Israel, because you have struggled and you have prevailed." Now, later on, God reiterates the blessing, a change of name. But God changes one very significant thing. The angel says, "Your name is not Jacob, it's going to be Israel." God says, "Your name is Jacob, and from now on it's going to be not Jacob, but Israel." So God says, on one hand, yeah, we're giving you a new name, but it doesn't mean the old name has disappeared. And the Talmud explains that when Abraham's name was changed from Avram to Avraham, the original name is gone. The original name represents a lower level of Abraham's existence. That name is gone, and one shouldn't call Abraham Abram unless they're reading the Torah, the section before his name was changed. Same thing with Sarah. Sarah's original name was Sarai. It was changed to Sarah. We no longer use the name Sarai. But when it comes to Abraham, to Jacob, we still use the name Jacob. The Torah constantly uses the name Jacob, not just Israel, not just Israel. And that's because God said, "Your name is still going to remain Jacob." Why did the angel want to change it? And God was not intent on changing it. So one answer is that the Jewish people have to go through two phases. There's a weekday phase, as I alluded to before, and there's a Shabbos phase. The weekday phase is where we struggle with evil, where we have to deal with the world the way the world is, and that we have to not be affected by the world. Shabbos is where we rise above the world. That's the world of Israel. So we have to still remain Jacob for the 6 days of the week, and Shabbos we become Israel. Also, the exile, the 6 millennia until Mashiach, we're told that the world exists for 6 millennia, and the end of the 6 millennia, that's when Mashiach comes, and we're at the end of the 6 millennia. But till Mashiach comes, we're basically in a Jacob, in a Yaakov mode. Yaakov comes from the word Akev, heels. We're in a lower level. Mashiach's coming will bring us to a perpetual Israel mode. But meanwhile, we still have to have the Yaakov mode. Another explanation given by a work called Arugas Habosem, a Hasidic commentary on the Torah, that the difference between Yaakov and Esau, Yaakov means heel. It also means the end. Yaakov was born not complete. He was born with a mission to reach an end, a constant effort to climb the ladder, to go higher and higher, and never feel I've already completed my task. I'm finished. When a person is finished, they're no longer needed in this world. A Jew should never think of himself as that I have completed, I've achieved enough, and now I can retire, I can go to Florida and play golf all day. I have nothing against golf, But a Jew has to know that even when you retire, you may be retired from a particular job, but you're not retired from life. And life is about constant growth and never feeling you've reached the end. That's what Yaakov indicates. He was constantly struggling to reach the end. Esau, the word Esau means completed. He was born complete, like an animal. An animal is essentially a complete animal as soon as it's born, or very soon after it's born. Esau was like an animal. He was the way he was at the beginning. He never felt he had to grow. He had to change. And Yaakov, excuse me, Yaakov was holding on to Esau's heels. Yaakov was struggling to reach the state of completion, of perfection. And that's why Yaakov's name still remains, because we always have to be struggling to reach Yisrael. There's a part of us that has achieved Yisrael in a certain sense, but a greater part of us has to always feel we're struggling towards that end. Why did Yaakov want to confront Esau? Why did he feel a need to confront Esau? And why did he even feel that Esau would accept him, would embrace him? After all, Esau was not shy to express his intentions, that he wants to kill him. And Esau was a murderer, our sages tell us. In fact, the day that Abraham passed away, Esau went out on a crime spree, including committing murder. So Yaakov felt that Esau had perhaps changed. Why did he feel he had changed? Because, as we discussed in another class, the reason why Yitzchak, Isaac, wanted to bless Esau, because Yitzchak was able to see deeper into Esau, that there was a certain spark, a certain core of holiness that was even deeper and more potent than the holiness of Jacob. And though Esau was rough and did the opposite of what was there in his core, Yitzchak thought that through the blessings that would help Esau reveal his inner holiness that was covered up, that was dormant. But he misjudged Esau. Rivka knew that wasn't possible, that only Jacob would be able to get the blessings, and through Jacob's blessings and his interaction with Esau, he would be able to refine Esau. Now, that was then when Yaakov got the blessings. Now it's more than 2 decades later. Yaakov thought perhaps Esau had already reached a certain state of refinement, and that core of his, that holy core, would be manifesting itself to some degree that would take away his anger and not want to kill Jacob anymore. Jacob was partially right, because Esau did embrace Yaakov and they kissed. But as Rashi says, in one interpretation, it was only a temporary thing. That was just a one-time thing. Esau went back to his hatred later on. That was a one-time thing. In other words, some of the inner core did come out, but it didn't have the ability to stay. It's like a flame. You strike a match, it burns a little bit, and then it extinguishes. This was not something that would endure. It's going to take a few thousand more years before Esau will be refined. And when that happens, that is part of what will happen imminently with the coming of Mashiach, that there will be a rapprochement, a reconciliation between Jacob and Esau. Esau will be refined, the negatives of Esau will be eliminated, and the positives will be fully manifested. And the spiritual core of Esau, which is so powerful and so potent, will give us and energize us and make our holiness even greater than it is right now.